My son slapped me across the face for saying Bryce was innocent, then warned, "Don't make me include you in my master plan." When I begged him to stop before someone got hurt, he laughed and said, "They share DNA with a killer. That makes them accomplices." I stayed silent. That was 10 months ago. Last night, he read Bryce's letter, dropped to his knees, and didn't get up for hours. My son Caleb died of an OD. The investigation deemed it a tragic accident, but his brother Dominic refused to believe it. So much so that at the funeral, he yelled, "Caleb was murdered," before dropping to his knees. The sound of my son sobbing into the microphone broke what was left of me. He cornered me in the kitchen that night. I'm gonna get justice for him. The next day, he went into school with nothing but a pen and paper to talk to every one of Caleb's classmates. When he came home, he went straight for his laptop and stayed awake all night researching something. I woke up to him not slept and drinking hard liquor at his desk. I begged him to go to bed, but he couldn't. He had some questions prepared for a kid named Bryce. He came home a few hours later. "It was Bryce!" he yelled, shoving his scribbled notes that smelled like alcohol in my face. I asked Bryce if he ever sold Caleb Adderall, and he said no. I stared at him blankly, and then he immediately changed the subject. I tried to say that didn't mean anything, but he interrupted. "He changed the subject, Mom. He's the one." That night, Dominic talked more about Bryce than he talked about Caleb. Within 2 weeks, Dominic's entire life revolved around Bryce. He'd follow him to school in the mornings, sneak into his classes to observe him, then spend evenings locked in his room working on what he called his ultimate plan. He even started following Bryce's car when he drove his little sister to her dance recitals. On the 1-month anniversary of Caleb's death, I bought flowers and asked Dominic to come visit the grave with me. He hadn't even gone once yet. "I can't," he said. "Bryce gets lunch at Chipotle every Saturday at 12:30. I need to be there." I went alone and cried for both my sons. It got worse when I found a tracker device receipt in our bin. "I put it under Bryce's car," he said proudly. "He drives somewhere every Tuesday at 7. I work on my master plan then and can't follow him, so I just track him." That night, I woke up to a house alarm and an ambulance blaring down the street. Dominic wasn't in his room, but as I was calling him, he rushed back in, dressed in all black, and sprinted to his room. He drunkenly babbled in the morning that he'd thrown bricks through Bryce's windows. Bryce's mother had a heart condition, and triggering the alarms gave her a stroke. When I confronted him, he slurred, "I lost a brother. He should lose something too." I told him, "Don't become the monster you think you're destroying," and his face went dark. "You're choosing Caleb's killer over your sons?" He then stepped closer. "Don't make me include you in my master plan, Mom." The threat in his voice made me step back. Despite being genuinely afraid, I sat him down that weekend. I asked what proof he had that Bryce did it, and his eyes went wide. He pulled out spreadsheets, showing me timestamps of Bryce taking his little sister to practice. Isn't it weird how he goes at the exact same time every week? He had also recorded Bryce going into pharmacies and walking out with paracetamol, and had screenshots of Bryce's social media where he'd found clear hidden meanings. When I explained how this wasn't proof, he yelled, "That's the difference between us. He does something about the problem. I sit here and cry all day." 2 days later, I got a call from the nursing home. It was about Dominic. He'd gone in to see Bryce's grandmother, who had dementia, and spent hours telling her that her grandson was a murderer. That evening, I was more blunt than I'd ever been with him. "What makes you think it's okay to torment Bryce's family?" "Because," he started, "they share DNA with a killer. That makes them accomplices. I understand you're grieving, but you need to stop," I replied. "This is an innocent man's innocent." Dominic shot up, interrupting. He slapped me across the face hard. "If you think he's innocent, you're just as bad." He left me crying on the couch while he went out to follow Bryce because his tracker started going off. Soon, Bryce's mother personally called me. She sounded like she had just finished crying and told me to get my son under control before they pressed charges. Turns out, Dominic cornered their 11-year-old daughter after school. He told her she'd grow up to be a killer like her brother. I was devastated. I apologized and promised her Dominic would never bother her family again. But then right as I was hanging up, I got a call from Dominic's principal. Dominic was caught adding peanuts into Bryce's lunch. Dominic swore it was an accident. But how do you accidentally open someone's bag, take out their lunch, and add the one ingredient they're allergic to? Thanksgiving weekend was 4 days away, and I remember it especially well. I'd spent the entire day cooking a meal Dominic didn't eat and went to bed without saying goodnight. He was locked in his room laughing about the ultimate plan. This terrible feeling suddenly washed over me, the kind where I just knew. I stayed awake waiting for something. Him calling someone coming in, anything. And then at 2 a.m., I heard it, him leaving the house. I looked out the window and saw him pulling out. I ran down, got in my own car, and started driving. The first place I checked was Bryce's house down the street, but there wasn't a single car and nobody was home. The only other place I could think of was Bryce's grandfather's home. I remember seeing the address written on one of the incoherent pages Dominic showed me. I put it into GPS and sped there, but before I even got to it, I saw it. Smoke filling the sky. And the closer I got, the clearer it became. Dominic had set Bryce's grandfather's house on fire, with Bryce, his parents, his sister and grandparents, as well as his 4-year-old cousin all inside. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out, running toward the flames. The heat hit me like a wall, and I could hear screaming from inside. Dominic's car sat in the driveway, engine still running. I grabbed my phone and called 911 while searching frantically for any way to help. The front door hung open, smoke pouring out. Through the chaos, I saw Bryce's father dragging his mother out the side door, both of them coughing violently. His sister stumbled out behind them, clutching the 4-year-old cousin. But where was Bryce and his grandfather? Dominic emerged from around the back of the house, his face illuminated by the orange glow. He saw me and froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he started walking toward his car, calm as could be. I blocked his path. He tried to push past me, but I grabbed his arm. He yanked it away and shoved me hard. I fell backward onto the grass, feeling the heat from the house on my face. He stepped over me and headed for his car again. The fire trucks arrived just as Bryce burst through a window, his grandfather's arm around his shoulders. They both collapsed on the lawn, and paramedics rushed to them. I watched my son drive away while sirens filled the night. Back home, I sat in the dark kitchen waiting. He came through the door at sunrise, reeking of smoke. He went straight to the refrigerator like nothing had happened. I stood up, my whole body shaking. He turned around with a water bottle in his hand. His expression was completely blank. No guilt, no fear, nothing. Just emptiness where my son used to be. I told him him I saw everything. He shrugged and started walking to his room. I followed him, demanding answers. He spun around in the hallway, his face suddenly twisted with rage. He raised his fist, and I flinched, but he just punched the wall instead, leaving a hole in the drywall. He went into his room and locked the door. I heard him moving furniture around, barricading himself in. I pounded on the door, begging him to talk to me. Nothing, just the sound of him typing on his laptop. The next morning, I woke up on the couch where I'd fallen asleep crying. Dominic's door was open. His room was empty except for a note on his desk. Phase 1 complete. You chose wrong. I searched the house and found him in the basement, surrounded by printed photos of Bryce's family. Red X marks covered their faces. He had a new notebook labeled Phase 2 open in front of him. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes. I could smell the alcohol from across the room. He'd been up all night again, planning something worse. I tried to take the notebook, but he clutched it to his chest. We struggled over it until pages scattered everywhere. I saw horrible things written on them, detailed plans about Bryce's little sister's dance recital, times, locations, access points. I told him this had to stop. He laughed, actually laughed, and said I didn't understand dedication. Caleb deserved justice, and if I wouldn't help, I was just another obstacle. The doorbell rang. We both froze. Through the basement window, I could see a police car in the driveway. Dominic's eyes went wide. He shoved past me and ran upstairs. I answered the door to find 2 officers asking about the fire. They wanted to speak with Dominic. I said he wasn't home, my voice shaking. They asked when he'd be back. I didn't know what to say. After they left, I found Dominic packing a bag in his room. He said he needed to lay low for a few days, maybe stay with a friend. I knew he didn't have any friends anymore. They'd all distanced themselves after Caleb died and Dominic started his obsession. I couldn't let him leave, not when he was planning something involving Bryce's little sister. I stood in his doorway, refusing to move. He tried to push past, but I held firm. That's when he really lost it. He grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me hard. My head snapped back and forth. He was screaming about betrayal, about choosing strangers over family, about how Caleb would be disgusted with me. I broke free and ran to the kitchen, grabbing my phone. There's something deeply unsettling about how quickly Dominic shifted from grief to obsession, and I wonder what really triggered such an extreme fixation on Bryce after just one changed subject during questioning. He followed, trying to wrestle it away. We knocked over chairs, sent dishes crashing to the floor. Finally, he got the phone and threw it against the wall, shattering it. He left while I was picking up the pieces. I heard his car peel out of the driveway. Using the landline, I called Bryce's mother to warn her. She was crying before I even spoke. The grandfather was in critical condition from smoke inhalation. The 4-year-old had nightmares and wouldn't stop screaming. I promised I'd find Dominic and stop him. She said they were staying with relatives out of town until they felt safe. Good. At least they were away from him for now. But I knew Dominic. He'd find them. He always found Bryce. I spent the rest of that morning searching for Dominic. His car wasn't at any of his usual spots. Not the gym where he used to work out before Caleb died. Not the diner where they used to grab breakfast together. Not even the liquor store where he'd been buying bottles every other day. My hands trembled as I drove past Bryce's empty house. The windows were boarded up from where Dominic had thrown the bricks. A for sale sign stood crooked in the front yard. They weren't coming back. I pulled into my driveway to find my sister Bella's car parked outside. She stood on my porch with her arms crossed, her face a mixture of concern and frustration. I'd been avoiding her calls for weeks. She followed me inside and immediately started picking up the broken dishes from my fight with Dominic. I tried to help, but she waved me away and pointed to the couch. We sat in silence while she swept glass into a dustpan. When she finished, she pulled out her phone and showed me a local news article about the fire. The grandfather was still in the ICU. The family had started a fundraiser for medical bills and to replace everything they'd lost. My stomach churned seeing the photo of their destroyed home. Bella asked where Dominic was. I shook my head. She grabbed my shoulders, forcing me to look at her. Her expression was fierce as she explained that this couldn't continue. Either I got Dominic help or she would make the call herself. I spent the afternoon calling every motel within a 50-mile radius. None had seen Dominic or his car. As evening approached, exhaustion weighed on me like a physical force. I hadn't eaten since yesterday. Bella made sandwiches while I stared at my broken phone, wishing Dominic would somehow call. Around 7, I remembered something. Dominic had mentioned Bryce going somewhere every Tuesday at 7. Today was Tuesday. If Dominic was still tracking him, he might show up wherever Bryce usually went. I grabbed Bella's phone and pulled up the tracking app Dominic had shown me weeks ago. He'd given me the login information in case something happened to him. The irony wasn't lost on me as I typed in the password. The tracker showed movement. Not Bryce's car, but the tracker itself was moving. Someone had found it and was carrying it. The signal led to a parking lot behind an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Bella insisted on coming with me. We drove in tense silence, her knuckles white as she gripped the door handle. The warehouse district was mostly abandoned, full of broken windows and rusted metal doors. We parked a block away and walked carefully toward the signal. Dominic's car sat alone in the empty lot. The engine was off, but I could see him slumped in the driver's seat. Empty bottles littered the passenger side. Bella stayed back while I approached. I knocked on the window. Dominic jerked awake, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus. He fumbled with the door handle before managing to open it. The smell of alcohol hit me immediately. He stumbled out, using the car for support. His clothes were the same ones from the fire, now wrinkled and stained. He blinked at me in confusion, then his face hardened. He pushed past me, heading for the warehouse. I followed him to a side door that hung open on broken hinges. Inside, the warehouse was dark except for streams of light filtering through holes in the roof. Dominic navigated through the debris like he'd been here before. In a cleared area near the back, he'd set up a makeshift command center. Maps covered the walls, marked with red pins and string connecting different locations. Photos of Bryce's family were everywhere. Notebooks filled with his cramped handwriting covered a folding table. Dominic collapsed into a metal chair and opened another bottle. He gestured at his work with pride, explaining how he'd tracked every movement, every pattern, every connection. His words slurred together as he pointed out details that made no sense. Bella appeared in the doorway. She surveyed the scene with disgust, then started pulling down the maps. Dominic shot up, knocking over his chair. He lunged at her, but his coordination was gone. He tripped over the chair and crashed to the floor. While he struggled to get up, I grabbed as many notebooks as I could carry. Bella collected the photos, shoving them into a garbage bag she'd found. found. Dominic crawled toward us, begging us to stop, saying we were ruining everything. We hauled everything outside. Bella found a metal drum and started a fire. One by one, we fed Dominic's obsession to the flames. He watched from the doorway, too hammered to stand, tears streaming down his face. When the last photo burned, Dominic let out a sound I'd never heard before. Part scream, part sob, pure anguish. He curled into himself on the concrete, shaking. Bella and I exchanged glances. This wasn't just about Bryce anymore. This was about Caleb, about grief so deep it had twisted into something monstrous. We managed to get Dominic into Bella's car. He didn't fight us, just sat there staring at nothing. We drove him home and put him to bed. Bella stayed to make sure he didn't leave again while I cleaned up the basement. I found more than just plans down there. Hidden behind a stack of boxes was a shrine to Caleb. Photos from when they were kids, report cards, birthday cards, everything Dominic had saved over the years. In the center was Caleb's favorite hoodie, the one he'd worn the night he died. My legs gave out. I sat on the cold concrete floor, holding that hoodie, and finally understood. Dominic wasn't just angry. He was drowning in guilt. He needed someone to blame because the alternative was accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen. Bella found me there an hour later. She helped me up and we went to check on Dominic. He was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, more sober now. He looked at us with hollow eyes and asked what happened to his research. When we told him we'd burned it, he nodded slowly. Then he asked about Bryce's family, if they were okay. It was the first time he'd shown concern for them as people rather than targets. Bella told him about the grandfather, about the little girl's nightmares. Dominic's face crumpled. Over the next few days, Bella and I took shifts watching him. He didn't try to leave, just moved between his bed and the couch like a ghost. He wouldn't eat unless we forced him. He'd start sentences about Caleb, then trail off mid-thought. On the fourth day, I woke to find Dominic's door open and his bed empty. Panic shot through me as I searched the house. I found him in Caleb's room, sitting on the floor surrounded by old photos. He was writing something, his hand steady for the first time in months. He looked up when I entered. His eyes were clear, focused. He handed me what he'd written. It was a letter to Bryce's family, not an excuse or justification, but an acknowledgement of what he'd done, an apology that didn't ask for forgiveness. I sat beside him on the floor. We looked through photos together, remembering Caleb as he really was. Not perfect, not murdered, just a kid who made a mistake that cost him everything. Dominic talked about the last time they'd hung out, how Caleb had seemed fine, happy even, how maybe that's what hurt the most. Bella joined us, bringing coffee and tissues. We spent hours in that room, grieving properly for the first time. Dominic cried until he had nothing left, then cried some more. By afternoon, he was exhausted, but somehow lighter. That evening, Dominic asked me to drive him somewhere. I was hesitant until he showed me the address. It was a grief counseling center Bella had researched. He'd called and made an appointment while I was in the shower. The counselor was a soft-spoken woman named Kathy, who specialized in traumatic loss. Dominic went in alone while I waited in the lobby. An hour later, he came out with red eyes and a card for his next appointment. On the drive home, he stared out the window quietly. Then he asked if I thought Bryce's family would ever feel safe again. I told him I didn't know. He nodded and said he wanted to pay for their therapy too, if they'd let him. Not as manipulation or to ease his guilt, but because it was the right thing to do. The next week was a blur of counseling sessions, difficult conversations, and slowly dismantling the fortress Dominic had built around his pain. He gave me all his tracking equipment to destroy. He deleted the social media accounts he'd used to stalk Bryce. He even called his old boss to ask about getting his job back. But recovery isn't linear. One night, I caught him parked outside the Chipotle where Bryce used to eat lunch. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there staring at the building. When I knocked on his window, he started like he'd been sleepwalking. I got in the passenger seat. We sat in silence until he finally spoke. He told me how he'd memorized Bryce's entire routine, how he knew more about Bryce's daily life than he remembered about Caleb's. How twisted was that? He'd spent more time obsessing over a stranger than mourning his own brother. We drove to the cemetery instead. It was Dominic's first visit since the funeral. Breaking into someone's makeshift stalker headquarters is peak sibling intervention material. Bella deserves a medal for torching that conspiracy board, while Dominic literally crawled around drunk begging them to stop tracking his tracking obsession. He stood at Caleb's grave for a long time, not speaking, just being present. When he finally placed his hand on the headstone, his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Bella met us there with flowers. She'd been visiting Caleb weekly, talking to him about everything that had happened. She said she'd told him about Dominic's breakdown, about the fire, about the long road ahead. She believed Caleb would want his brother to heal, not destroy himself with vengeance. As we were leaving, a car pulled up nearby. My heart stopped when I recognized Bryce's mother. She was alone, carrying a small bouquet. She saw us and froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Then she walked over, her steps careful but determined. She looked directly at Dominic and told him she'd gotten his letter. She wasn't ready to forgive, might never be, but she appreciated his words. Her father was recovering. Her daughter was in therapy. They were trying to move forward. Dominic couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears running down his face. She turned to me and said she hoped we could find peace. Then she walked to a grave several rows over, her own loss, her own grief to tend. The encounter shook Dominic badly. That night, he had his worst breakdown yet. He destroyed his room, throwing furniture and screaming about how he'd ruined everything. Bella and I could only watch as he exhausted himself, finally collapsing among the wreckage. His counselor recommended intensive outpatient treatment, 3 days a week, group therapy with others who'd lost family to overdoses. Dominic resisted at first, but after sitting in on one session, something clicked. These people understood his anger, his need to blame someone, anyone, for a loss that made no sense. I started attending a support group for family members. Hearing other parents talk about their children's obsessions, their misdirected anger, their inability to process grief, helped me realize I wasn't alone. One mother talked about how her daughter had stalked the doctor who'd failed to save her sister. Another described her son's conspiracy theories about his father's car accident. Dominic slowly began engaging with the group. He shared his story in pieces, each session revealing more. The other members didn't judge. They'd all been where he was in different ways. One man, Nicholas, became a particular support. He'd lost his brother to an OD 5 years ago and had gone through his own dark period of blame and rage. Nicholas invited Dominic to coffee after group one day. They talked for hours. Nicholas shared how he'd almost destroyed his own life seeking vengeance against against his brother's dealer, how he'd lost his job, his girlfriend, nearly his freedom, but he'd found his way back. It was possible. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own guilt. How had I let it get so bad? Why hadn't I gotten Dominic help sooner? Bella reminded me that grief makes people do terrible things, that I'd been drowning too. We'd all been trying to survive an unsurvivable loss. 3 weeks into treatment, Dominic came home with a purpose. He wanted to create a memorial fund in Caleb's name, not for addiction services, that felt too heavy, but for the things Caleb had loved. Music programs at the high school, art supplies for kids who couldn't afford them, something positive from all this pain. We spent evenings planning it together. Dominic threw himself into the project with the same intensity he'd applied to stalking Bryce, but this time building instead of destroying. He contacted Caleb's old teachers, his friends, anyone who'd been touched by his brother's creativity. The planning helped, but there were still bad days. Days when Dominic couldn't get out of bed. Days when he'd see something that reminded him of Bryce and have to leave wherever he was. Days when the guilt threatened to swallow him whole. On one particularly bad night, I found him writing another letter. This one was to Caleb. Pages and pages of apology for failing him, for turning his death into something ugly, for becoming someone Caleb wouldn't recognize. I sat with him while he wrote, not reading, just being there. When he finished, we drove to the cemetery together. It was past midnight, technically not allowed, but we needed this. Dominic read the letter aloud at Caleb's grave, his voice breaking on every other word. Then he burned it, letting the ashes scatter in the wind. On the way home, he told me about a dream he'd been having. Caleb was alive, but Dominic couldn't reach him. Every time he got close, Caleb would disappear. His counselor said it was his mind processing the inability to save his brother, to change what happened. Bella suggested we go through Caleb's things together. We'd avoided it, leaving his room untouched like a shrine, but maybe it was time. Dominic agreed, though his hands shook as we opened the door. We found normal teenage things, dirty clothes shoved under the bed, half-finished homework, a guitar with 2 broken strings, but also beautiful sketches we'd never seen, poems about feeling lost, a journal where he'd written about experimenting with substances, about feeling pressure to fit in. Dominic read every word, searching for signs he'd missed, but there weren't any clear warnings. Caleb had been struggling, yes, but not in ways that screamed danger. Sometimes tragedy doesn't announce itself, sometimes it just happens. Among Caleb's things, we found a birthday card he'd bought for Dominic but never given him. Inside, he'd written about how proud he was of his big brother, how he hoped to be like him someday. Dominic clutched that card like a lifeline. The memorial fund launch approached. Dominic wanted to invite Bryce's family, to show them he was trying to make amends through action. I helped him write the invitation, making it clear they were under no obligation to come or even respond. To our surprise, Bryce's mother called. She thanked us for the invitation but said they weren't ready. Maybe someday, but not yet. She did say that Bryce was doing better. He'd started college early to get away from the memories. He was studying to become a counselor himself, wanting to help kids dealing with trauma. The news hit Dominic hard. Bryce was moving forward, building a future, while Caleb never would. But instead of anger, he felt something like relief. At least he hadn't destroyed Bryce's life completely. There was still hope for healing. The night before the memorial fund launch, Dominic couldn't sleep. I found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at photos of Caleb on his phone. He asked if I thought Caleb would forgive him. I told him Caleb had loved him unconditionally, that love doesn't end with death. The launch was small but meaningful. Caleb's teachers came, his friends, kids who'd known him from art class. They shared stories about his kindness, his talent, his terrible jokes. Dominic spoke last, his voice steady as he talked about channeling grief into something positive. We raised enough to fund the first year of programs. Dominic personally delivered the check to the school, along with some of Caleb's artwork to display. The principal, who'd been the one to call about the peanut incident, shook his hand and said she was proud of how far he'd come. But healing isn't a straight line. A week later, Dominic relapsed, not into stalking, but into drinking. I came home to find him passed out in Caleb's room, empty bottles around him. The anniversary of Caleb's death was approaching, and the weight of it was crushing him. Bella and I got him back into intensive counseling. His therapist, Kathy, recommended adding medication to help with the depression underlying his grief. Dominic resisted at first, seeing it as weakness, but eventually agreed to try. The medication helped stabilize his moods, but the real work was still in therapy. He started processing not just Caleb's death, but their entire relationship. The times he'd been too busy for his little brother, the fights they'd had, the normal sibling dynamics that now felt weighted with significance. One session, he talked about the last time he'd seen Caleb alive. They'd argued about something stupid. Dominic couldn't even remember what. He'd left angry. 3 hours later, Caleb was gone. That fight haunted him more than anything else. Kathy helped him understand that their last interaction didn't define their relationship, that Caleb knew he was loved despite the argument, that most people don't get perfect goodbyes because we never know when goodbye is really goodbye. Slowly, Dominic began to separate his grief from his guilt, to mourn Caleb without the crushing weight of responsibility, to accept that he couldn't have saved his brother because he hadn't known his brother needed saving. He still had the urge to check on Bryce sometimes. When he'd see a car that looked like Bryce's, his heart would race, but he'd call Nicholas instead of following. They'd talk through the impulse until it passed. Each time got a little easier. The memorial fund grew. Other families who'd lost children to overdoses contributed. Dominic spoke at a fundraiser, sharing his story of grief turned to obsession, turned to purpose. He didn't minimize what he'd done, but he showed that redemption was possible. After his speech, a woman approached. Her son had died the same week as Caleb. She'd spent months convinced the hospital had made a mistake, demanding investigations, threatening lawsuits. She saw herself in Dominic's story. They exchanged numbers, another connection in his growing support network. As Caleb's death anniversary approached, we planned how to handle it. Dominic wanted to do something meaningful, but was terrified of falling apart. We decided on a small gathering at the cemetery, just family and close friends. The morning of the anniversary, Dominic woke up calm. He made breakfast, something he hadn't done in months. He showed me a new letter he'd written, this one to himself. The cemetery meeting with Bryce's mother makes me wonder how she found the strength to approach them after everything that happened. Did receiving Dominic's letter help her process her own family's trauma, or was she already on her own healing journey when it arrived? A promise to honor Caleb by living well, by choosing healing over hatred. At the cemetery, we shared memories of Caleb. His art teacher brought a piece he'd been working on before he died. His best friend played a song on the guitar Caleb had taught him. Dominic read a poem Caleb had written, his voice strong and clear. As we were leaving, another car arrived. Bryce's mother again, alone. She approached slowly, holding an envelope. She handed it to Dominic without a word. Inside was a letter from Bryce. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, understanding. A door cracked open to the possibility of peace. Dominic stood there reading, tears flowing freely. When he finished, he looked at Bryce's mother and simply said thank you. She nodded and walked to her father's grave. Two families, bound by tragedy, finding their own ways forward. That night, Dominic showed me his journal. He'd been writing every day, processing his emotions on paper instead of acting on them. The early entries were dark, full of rage and plans for revenge, but gradually, they shifted. The recent ones talked about hope, about building something from the ashes. He'd written about wanting to speak at schools about grief and obsession, to warn other kids who'd lost siblings about the dangerous paths pain could take, to maybe save someone else from becoming what he'd become. Bella helped him prepare his first presentation. They practiced in our living room, Dominic sharing his story while we offered feedback. It was raw, honest, uncomfortable, but that's what would make it powerful. His first speaking engagement was at a local community center. Only a dozen people showed up, but Dominic spoke like it was a packed auditorium. He told them everything. The stalking, the fire, the complete breakdown of his moral compass in the face of unbearable loss. Afterward, a teenage boy approached him. He'd lost his sister in a car accident and had been cyberbullying the other driver. Hearing Dominic's story made him realize where he was headed. They talked for an hour after everyone else left. Word spread about Dominic's presentations. Schools started inviting him. Grief support groups, community organizations. Each time he spoke, he had to relive the worst period of his life. But if it helped one person, he said, it was worth it. The speaking helped Dominic too. Each time he told the story, it lost a little of its power over him. He could talk about Bryce without his hands clenching. He could mention the fire without feeling the heat on his face. The memories were still painful, but they no longer controlled him. 6 months after the fire, Dominic got a job at a local nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth. His boss knew his history and hired him because of it, not despite it. Who better to recognize kids spiraling into darkness than someone who'd been there? He threw himself into the work with dedication, not the obsessive kind that had consumed him before, but healthy commitment. He came home tired but fulfilled, telling stories about the kids he was helping. Some reminded him of Caleb, others reminded him of himself. One day, he came home particularly shaken. A kid had talked about wanting revenge on someone he blamed for his friend's death. Dominic had seen himself so clearly in that boy's eyes. He'd spent hours talking him through it, sharing his own story, showing where that path led. The boy had broken down crying, just like Dominic had in that warehouse. Sometimes people need to see the worst-case scenario to step back from the edge. Dominic had become that cautionary tale, and he wore it like armor. Progress came in small victories. Dominic deleted the tracking apps from his phone. He drove past Chipotle without looking for Bryce's car. He could hear Bryce's name without flinching. Each step forward was hard-won, but precious. Bella noticed the changes, too. Dominic smiled more. He made plans for the future. He talked about maybe going back to school, getting a degree in counseling. He wanted to turn his experience into expertise that could help others. The Memorial Fund held its first art show, displaying work by kids who'd received supplies through Caleb's program. Dominic walked through the gallery with wonder, seeing his brother's legacy in every painting, every sketch. This was what honoring Caleb looked like. Not revenge, but inspiration. At the show, a familiar face appeared. Nicholas had brought his own family, including his nephew, who was one of the beneficiaries. The kid showed Dominic a portrait he'd painted, thanking him for making it possible. Dominic had to excuse himself to cry in the bathroom. That night, we had dinner as a family for the first time in almost a year. Bella cooked Caleb's favorite meal. We set a place for him, not in morbid denial, but in acknowledgement. He was gone, but still part of us. Always would be. Dominic raised his glass of water, toasting Caleb's memory and the long road that had brought us here. We clinked glasses, and for a moment, I could almost see Caleb smiling at his brother. Not the tortured version Dominic had created in his grief, but the real Caleb who'd loved him despite everything. After dinner, Dominic asked if I'd help him redecorate his room. He wanted to take down the dark curtains, repaint the walls, make it a space for living instead of plotting. We spent the weekend transforming it together, talking and laughing like we hadn't in so long. While moving furniture, we found one of his old notebooks from the obsession days. Dominic flipped through it, shaking his head at his own delusions. Then he added it to a box of materials he was keeping for his presentations. Evidence of how far grief could push someone. The year anniversary of the fire approached. Dominic had been dreading it, worried about backsliding. But when the day came, he faced it head on. He wrote letters to everyone he'd hurt, not to send, but to acknowledge the harm he'd caused. He asked me to drive him past the grandfather's rebuilt house. They'd moved back in, the damage repaired. Seeing it whole again, seeing life continuing, gave him a strange peace. He tried to destroy so much, but people were resilient. They rebuilt. They moved forward. That evening, Bryce's mother called. She'd heard about Dominic's speaking engagements through a friend. She wanted him to know that her daughter was doing better. The therapy was helping. The nightmares had stopped. Time and treatment were healing wounds he'd inflicted. She also said something that stopped Dominic cold. Bryce had written another letter. He wasn't ready to send it yet, but he was working toward forgiveness. Not for Dominic's sake, but for his own. Carrying anger was exhausting. He wanted to let it go. Dominic thanked her for calling, for giving him hope he didn't deserve. After hanging up, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he pulled out his journal and wrote about the strange circularity of forgiveness, how he'd had to forgive himself before others could even consider forgiving him. The next day brought an unexpected challenge. Dominic ran into one of Bryce's friends at the grocery store. The friend recognized him, his face flushing with anger. For a moment, Dominic tensed, ready for confrontation. But instead of engaging, he simply apologized and walked away. He called Nicholas from the parking lot, shaking. Nicholas talked him through it, reminding him that not everyone would forgive or understand. That was okay. The work was in accepting that reality without letting it derail his progress. As months passed, Dominic's speaking engagements grew. He partnered with Kathy to develop a curriculum about grief and misdirected unexpected anger. They piloted it at a few schools with powerful results. Kids opened up about their own losses, their own dangerous thoughts. One presentation particularly affected him. A girl raised her hand and asked how he lived with himself after what he'd done. The room went silent. Dominic took a breath and answered honestly. Some days were harder than others, but helping people like her made it bearable. After that session, the school counselor pulled him aside. 3 students had approached her afterward, asking for help with their own revenge fantasies. Dominic's story had given them permission to admit they needed support before they crossed lines they couldn't uncross. The memorial fund expanded beyond art supplies. They started offering grief counseling scholarships. Dominic insisted on funding some specifically for siblings of OD victims. He knew firsthand how that particular loss could twist people into versions of themselves they didn't recognize. At home, we found new rhythms. Sunday dinners with Bella, movie nights where we'd watch Caleb's favorites, trips to the cemetery that felt peaceful instead of agonizing. We were learning to carry our grief instead of being crushed by it. Dominic started dating someone he met in group therapy. She'd lost her brother to sewer slide and understood the complicated emotions that came with sudden loss. They took things slow, both aware of how grief could complicate relationships, but it was good to see him opening his heart again. One evening, she joined us for dinner. Watching Dominic laugh at her stories, seeing him relaxed and present, I realized how far we'd all come. The son I'd feared was lost forever was finding his way back, different but whole. The holidays approached, our second without Caleb. We decided to volunteer at a shelter, serving meals to people who had their own losses to bear. Dominic worked the kitchen with focus, finding purpose in feeding others. Caleb would have loved the act of service. While cleaning up, a man recognized Dominic from one of his presentations. He'd lost his son to an OD and had been consumed with tracking down the dealer. Dominic's story had stopped him from making the same mistakes. They hugged in the dish room, 2 fathers who'd almost lost themselves to vengeance. Something about this timeline doesn't quite add up. 6 months from nearly burning down a house to working with at-risk youth? That's an awfully quick transformation for someone who is tracking a person's every move and planning elaborate revenge schemes just months before. As the year drew to a close, Dominic reflected on everything that had changed. He'd gone from stalking an innocent family to helping prevent others from doing the same. From destroying to building. From hatred to something approaching peace. He still had bad days. Triggers that sent him spiraling. Moments where the old anger flared. But he had tools now. Support systems. Purpose beyond revenge. He was learning to honor Caleb through how he lived, not through who he punished. New Year's Eve found us at Bella's house. As midnight approached, Dominic raised his sparkling cider in another toast. To Caleb, who deserved better. To Bryce's family, who deserved peace. To second chances and the hard work of redemption. To moving forward without forgetting. We clinked glasses as fireworks lit the sky. Dominic stepped outside to watch them, and I followed. He stood there, face tilted up, tears mixing with snow. When he spoke, his voice was steady. He said Caleb had loved fireworks, said he was trying to love them again too. I put my arm around him as colors burst overhead. My surviving son, who'd walked through hell and somehow found his way back. Not the same person he'd been before Caleb died. That person was gone forever. But maybe this new version, forged in fire and tempered by remorse, was exactly who the world needed. As we headed inside, Dominic paused. He pulled out his phone and showed me a message he'd typed but not sent. It was to Bryce, simple and direct, an apology, a wish for peace in the new year, no expectation of response. He deleted it, saying he wasn't ready yet, but someday he'd find the right words. We rejoined the party. Dominic immediately pulled into a conversation with Nicholas about expanding their speaking program. As I watched him engage, plan, hope, I thought about the journey still ahead. Recovery wasn't a destination, but a daily choice. And every day, Dominic was choosing to be better than he'd been the day before. The work continued. The healing continued. The slow, painful, necessary process of learning to live with loss, without letting it destroy everything good that remained. It would take years more, maybe a lifetime, but we were committed to walking that path, one difficult step at a time, because that's what Caleb would have wanted. Not the darkness Dominic had fallen into, but the light he was fighting to find again. And in that light, however flickering and fragile, we could almost see our way forward, together, broken but not struck, changed but not conquered. A family learning to survive the unsurvivable, one day at a time. The next morning brought a development I should have anticipated. Dominic's car was gone, along with the spare key I kept hidden in the kitchen drawer. Bella had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from watching him all night. He must have slipped out while she dozed. I checked his room and found his bed neatly made, something he never did anymore. On the pillow sat a folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I opened it. The message was brief. Dance recital today, 3 p.m. Can't let Caleb down. Bella woke to my frantic movements as I searched for my car keys. I showed her the note, and her face went pale. We both knew what that meant. Bryce's sister had dance class, and Dominic had memorized her schedule weeks ago. We drove to the dance studio first, hoping to intercept him there. The parking lot was empty except for a few parents dropping off younger kids for morning classes. No sign of Dominic's car. The receptionist confirmed that the recital wasn't until afternoon. Bella suggested we split up to cover more ground. She'd check the routes between the studio and where Bryce's family was staying with relatives. I'd go back to the warehouse district in case Dominic had returned to his makeshift command center. The warehouse was deserted, but I noticed fresh tire tracks in the gravel. Inside, I found evidence that Dominic had been there recently. Empty energy drink cans, a sleeping bag in the corner, and worst of all, a new notebook on the table. This one labeled Final Phase. I grabbed the notebook and flipped through it frantically. The pages contained detailed sketches of the dance studio layout, notes about emergency exits, and timing calculations. At the bottom of one page, circled in red, she needs to understand loss. My phone buzzed with a text from Bella. She'd spotted Dominic's car parked behind a strip mall near the studio. When she approached, she saw him in the driver's seat, watching something on his laptop. Before she could reach him, he'd driven off. I met Bella back at the studio. We had 4 hours until the recital. 4 hours to find Dominic and stop whatever he was planning. The studio director was setting up for the afternoon performance, and we helped her arrange chairs while keeping watch for any sign of my son. Around noon, I remembered something. Dominic had mentioned that Bryce's family was staying with relatives, but he'd never said where. If he knew their location, he might go there directly instead of waiting for the recital. Bella called Bryce's mother while I continued searching. After several rings, she answered, her voice immediately tense when she heard who was calling. Bella explained the situation, and I could hear the fear in the woman's response even from across the car. They were staying 40 minutes away, but Bryce's sister would be returning for the recital. They debated skipping it, but she'd worked so hard on her routine. They didn't want Dominic to take that from her too. Bryce's mother promised to alert the family and take precautions. We spent the next 2 hours driving between the studio, the warehouse, and every place I could think Dominic might go. Each minute that passed felt like an eternity. Bella kept checking her mirrors, convinced every car might be him. At 2:30, we returned to the studio. Parents were starting to arrive, carrying flowers and cameras, normal families preparing to watch their children perform. I envied their simple worries about forgotten costumes or stage fright. We positioned ourselves where we could see both entrances. Bella watched the back while I stayed near the front. My heart jumped every time a car pulled up, but none were Dominic's. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe the note was just meant to scare me. Then I saw him. Not his car, but Dominic himself, walking calmly across the parking lot. He'd parked somewhere else and approached on foot. He wore dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low, but I knew my son's walk anywhere. I moved to intercept him, but he saw me coming. His face hardened, and he changed direction, heading for the side entrance. I called out, but he didn't stop. Parents turned to stare as I ran after him. He reached the door first and slipped inside. I followed, finding myself in a narrow hallway lined with dressing rooms. Young dancers in tutus scattered as I pushed past, searching for Dominic. Their chatter masked any sound of his footsteps. At the end of the hall, a door led to the backstage area. I caught a glimpse of Dominic's cap disappearing through it. The stage was set for the performance, with painted backdrops of a fairy tale forest. Ironic, considering the nightmare unfolding. I found him crouched behind a prop tree, peering through a gap in the curtains at the filling auditorium. In his hand was something I couldn't quite see. He was so focused on watching for Bryce's sister that he didn't notice me approaching. When I grabbed his shoulder, he spun around, nearly knocking me over. The object in his hand clattered to the floor. It was just a camera, but the look in his eyes was more frightening than any weapon. Complete disconnection, like he was looking through me. He tried to push past, but I held firm. We struggled silently, neither wanting to create a scene that would terrify the children. He was stronger, but I had desperation on my side. I managed to push him back toward the exit. Bella appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. Together, we maneuvered Dominic into the hallway. He fought us every step, his breathing ragged. When we finally got him outside, he broke free and ran toward the parking lot. I chased him, Bella close behind. He sprinted between cars, trying to lose us. Parents stared in confusion as we wove through the lot. Finally, he tripped over a parking barrier and went down hard, skinning his palms on the asphalt. While he was down, I grabbed the car keys from his pocket. He looked up at me with such betrayal, as if I was the one who'd crossed a line. Bella helped me get him to his feet, and we half carried, half dragged him to her car. He didn't speak during the drive home, just stared out the window with tears streaming down his face. When we pulled into our driveway, he made one more attempt to escape, but his heart wasn't in it. The fight had gone out of him. Inside, I made him sit at the kitchen table while Bella stood guard by the door. I placed his notebook in front of him, open to the page about making Bryce's sister understand loss. I asked him to explain what that meant. He looked at the page like he was seeing it for the first time. His hand traced the words he'd written, and his face crumpled. He started talking, but not about his plans, about Caleb, about how unfair it was that Bryce's sister got to dance while Caleb would never play guitar again. The words poured out in a jumbled stream, how he'd planned to ruin her recital, not hurt her physically, just take away something she loved, make her feel a fraction of what he felt every day. He'd thought if someone else understood the loss, his own might hurt less. Bella brought him water while he talked. He drank mechanically, still lost in his rambling explanation. He talked about watching other families be happy, how it felt like they were mocking his pain, how Bryce's family moving on with their lives felt like forgetting Caleb existed. I let him talk until he exhausted himself. Dominic's final phase notebook reads like the world's most depressing action movie script, except the big climax involves ruining a kid's dance recital with a camera instead of explosives. Grief really does make terrible film directors out of people. When he finally stopped, slumped in his chair, I told him the truth, that making others suffer wouldn't bring Caleb back, that Caleb would be horrified by what he'd become, that grief was not a weapon to wield against the innocent. He nodded, but I could see he wasn't really hearing me. The obsession had consumed him so completely that logic couldn't penetrate. Bella suggested we call his counselor for an emergency session, but I knew this was beyond what outpatient therapy could handle. That evening, I made the hardest decision of my life. While Dominic slept, exhausted from the day's events, I researched inpatient psychiatric facilities. He needed more help than we could provide at home. He needed to be somewhere safe, where he couldn't hurt others or himself. Bella helped me pack a bag for him. Basic clothes, toiletries, photos of our family from happier times. I included the birthday card Caleb had never given him, hoping it might help ground him during treatment. Every item I folded felt like another goodbye. The next morning, I woke Dominic early. He seemed calmer, almost resigned. When I explained where we were going, he didn't argue, just asked if he could say goodbye to Caleb first. We drove to the cemetery as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the headstones. He knelt at Caleb's grave for a long time, whispering things I couldn't hear. When he stood, he looked older somehow, defeated. He walked back to the car without prompting and got in the back seat. Bella squeezed my hand as I started the engine. The facility was 2 hours away, a cluster of buildings that looked more like a college campus than a hospital. The intake counselor was kind but thorough, asking difficult questions about Dominic's behavior. I answered honestly, each detail another weight on my chest. They explained the program: intensive therapy, medication management, group sessions with others dealing with complicated grief. The average stay was 3 to 6 months, depending on progress. Dominic would have limited contact with the outside world at first to help him break the obsessive patterns. When it came time to say goodbye, Dominic hugged me for the first time in months. He whispered an apology, not just for what he'd done, but for what he'd become. I told him I loved him, that I'd always love him no matter what, that getting help was brave, not weak. Bella and I drove home in silence. The house felt empty without him, even though his presence had become something to fear. I sat in his room, looking at the hole hole he'd punched in the wall, the remnants of his rage. Tomorrow I'd patch it, but tonight I just needed to sit with the grief. Over the following weeks, I received updates from the facility. Dominic was participating in treatment, though progress was slow. He'd had several setbacks, moments where the obsession flared and he'd tried to leave, but he was trying, and that was more than he'd done in months. I wrote him letters, telling him about daily life, about the memorial fund's progress, about how much I missed the son he used to be. I didn't know if he read them, but I needed to write them. Bella added her own notes, reminding him that family meant supporting each other through the darkest times. A month into his treatment, I got an unexpected call. Bryce's mother wanted to meet. My heart raced as I agreed, unsure what she might want. We met at a coffee shop, both of us awkward and guarded. She told me about her daughter's recital, how they'd almost canceled but decided not to let fear win, how her daughter had danced beautifully, unaware of the danger that had been prevented. She thanked me for stopping Dominic, for choosing to protect her family even though it meant betraying my son. I cried then, overwhelmed by her grace. She reached across the table and took my hand. We sat like that, two mothers bound by an impossible situation. She said she didn't forgive Dominic, might never be able to, but she understood he was sick with grief, that maybe, with treatment, he could find his way back. Before leaving, she gave me something, a program from the recital, with her daughter's name circled. Inside, she'd written a note. Every child deserves to dance without fear. Thank you for ensuring mine could. I kept that program, a reminder of the choice I'd made. The house remained quiet. I returned to work, trying to establish some normalcy. Colleagues who knew about Caleb's death didn't know about Dominic's breakdown. I let them think he was away at school. The truth was too complicated, too painful to explain. Bella visited more frequently, helping me maintain the house and my sanity. We repainted Dominic's room, choosing a soft blue that reminded us of calmer times. We left spaces for him to add his own touches when he came home, if he came home changed. 3 months passed. The facility called with good news. Dominic had made significant progress. He'd moved to a less restrictive unit, had privileges to walk the grounds. He'd even started helping with art therapy groups, sharing Caleb's love of creativity with other patients. They suggested a family session. I drove up with Bella, nervous about seeing him after so long. Would he blame me for having him committed? Would the anger still burn in his eyes? Or would I find my son again, buried under all that pain? The Dominic who walked into the meeting room was different, thinner, but clearer somehow. His eyes met mine without the wild intensity that had frightened me. When he smiled, it was sad but genuine. He looked like someone who'd been broken apart and was slowly reassembling the pieces. The session was difficult. He talked about understanding now how sick he'd been, how the grief had twisted into something monstrous. He apologized, not just for his actions but for the fear he'd caused, for making me choose between protecting him and protecting others. He showed us his journal from treatment, pages of processing, of untangling the grief from the rage. He'd written letters to everyone he'd hurt, though the therapist advised against sending them. The work was in acknowledging the harm, not seeking absolution. When the session ended, we walked the grounds together. Dominic pointed out places that had become meaningful during his stay. The bench where he'd first admitted Caleb wasn't murdered. The garden where he'd helped plant flowers, finding peace in nurturing life instead of destroying it. As we prepared to leave, he asked about Bryce's family. Were they okay? Had they moved back home? I told him what I knew, watching his face carefully. He nodded, processing. Then he said something that showed how far he'd come. He hoped they felt safe again. The drive home was bittersweet. Dominic wasn't coming with us yet, but there was hope now. Real hope. Not the false kind I'd clung to during his obsession. He had more work to do, more healing ahead, but he was on the right path. That night, I found myself in Caleb's room. I told him about his brother, about the long journey still ahead. I like to think Caleb would be proud that Dominic was fighting his way back, that love was stronger than grief, even when grief tried to destroy everything. Bella stayed over, and we talked late into the night about forgiveness. Not just others forgiving Dominic, but him forgiving himself. That might be the hardest part, living with what he'd done, who he'd become, while trying to build something better from the ruins. Weeks turned to months. Dominic progressed to day passes, then overnight visits home. Each time, we navigated the awkwardness of trying to be a family again. He was different, would always be different, but different didn't mean lost. He started speaking at the facility's group sessions, sharing his story with newer patients. The counselors said it helped both him and them. He could see his journey from the outside, recognize how far he'd traveled from those dark days of stalking and planning. 6 months after admission, Dominic was discharged. The morning I picked him up, snow was falling, covering the world in clean white. He stood outside the facility with one bag, looking small and uncertain. When he got in the car, he asked if we could drive past Bryce's house. I tensed, but his therapist had prepared me for this. Facing the reality of what he'd done was part of recovery. We drove slowly past the house, now occupied by a new family. Dominic stared at it, then asked me to keep driving. The obsession was broken. At home, he walked through each room like a stranger. Bella had prepared a welcome home dinner, keeping it small and quiet. Just the three of us, trying to find our new normal. Dominic ate slowly, commenting on how different real food tasted after months of institutional meals. That night, I heard him moving around his room. I found him sitting on the floor, holding the birthday card from Caleb. He looked up with tears in his eyes and asked if I thought Caleb would recognize him now. I sat beside him and said Caleb would see his brother fighting to heal. The next weeks were about establishing routines. Dominic attended outpatient therapy 3 times a week. He started volunteering at a local art center, teaching kids to paint. He avoided anywhere he might encounter Bryce's family, respecting the boundaries that needed to exist. One afternoon, I came home to find him planting flowers in the front yard. He'd bought them with money from odd jobs, wanting to contribute something beautiful. As he worked, he talked about maybe going back to school eventually. Not yet, but someday, when he was steadier. Bella helped him look into online courses. Nothing too ambitious at first, just general education requirements. The structure helped, gave him purpose beyond therapy and volunteering. He studied at the kitchen table, occasionally asking for help with assignments. 3 months after his return, we attended a memorial service for OD victims. Dominic sat between Bella and me, holding our hands tightly. The way Dominic's brain rewired itself during treatment really makes me wonder about how grief physically changes our neural pathways. How did those art therapy sessions help him untangle the obsession from the actual loss? When they read Caleb's name name among the others lost, he stood briefly, acknowledging the loss without the rage that once consumed him. After the service, a woman approached. Her son had been in treatment with Dominic. She wanted to thank him for sharing his story, for showing her son that recovery from grief-fueled obsession was possible. Dominic listened quietly, then offered her hope that her son would find his way too. We developed new traditions. Sunday dinners where we talked about Caleb openly, sharing memories without the weight of unprocessed grief. Movie nights watching films Caleb had loved. Visits to his grave that felt peaceful rather than tortured. Dominic still had difficult days, anniversaries that triggered memories, moments when he'd see something that reminded him of his obsession. But he had tools now, strategies for managing the feelings without acting on them. He'd call his therapist or Bella or me, talking through the urges until they passed. One evening, he asked if I thought he'd ever be able to make amends to Bryce's family, not seeking forgiveness, just acknowledging the harm in a way that might help them heal. I told him that might never be possible, that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. He nodded, accepting this as another consequence of his actions. The memorial fund continued growing. Dominic contributed when he could, finding purpose in supporting programs Caleb would have loved. He attended fundraisers, though he stayed in the background. His presence was about service, not recognition. A year after his release, Dominic got a part-time job at a frame shop. The owner knew his history and hired him anyway, believing in second chances. He threw himself into the work, finding satisfaction in preserving other people's memories while learning to live with his own. He moved into a small apartment nearby, ready for independence but close enough for support. Bella and I helped him furnish it with secondhand finds and donations. The space was modest but his, a symbol of rebuilding a life nearly destroyed by grief. We had dinner together twice a week, maintaining connection while respecting boundaries. Dominic cooked sometimes, recipes he'd learned in treatment, simple meals shared with careful conversation, each gathering a small victory over the isolation that had nearly consumed him. One night, he told me about a dream where Caleb forgave him, not for the death, which wasn't his fault, but for what came after, for turning grief into weapon. In the dream, Caleb just wanted his brother to live well. Dominic woke with a sense of peace he hadn't felt since before the funeral. Progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments of regression, but the trajectory was upward, toward healing and hope. Dominic was learning to carry his grief without letting it define him, to honor Caleb through how he lived each day. The second anniversary of the fire passed quietly. Dominic spent it in reflection, writing in his journal about accountability and growth. He'd learned that some actions couldn't be undone, only lived with. The goal wasn't forgetting, but integrating the experience into a life worth living. Bella organized a small memorial for Caleb at the art center where Dominic volunteered. Children displayed paintings inspired by his memory. Dominic spoke briefly about his brother's creativity, his voice steady and clear. The boy who'd screamed about murder at the funeral had become a man who could celebrate a life while accepting its loss. As time passed, the acute pain dulled to a manageable ache. We learned to laugh again, to make plans, to hope. Dominic dated occasionally, though he was honest about his past with anyone who might become serious. Some walked away. Others saw his journey as evidence of strength. He finished his associate degree online, then enrolled in a bachelor's program for social work. He wanted to help others navigate grief and trauma, to be the support he'd needed in those dark early days. His professors noted his insight came from hard-won experience. The day he graduated, Bella and I sat in the audience crying, not just for the achievement, but for the journey. The son we'd nearly lost to grief-fueled obsession stood on stage receiving his diploma. Caleb wasn't there to see it, but somehow we felt his presence in our pride. Dominic found work at a grief counseling center, starting as an intake coordinator. His supervisor knew his history and saw it as an asset. Who better to recognize the warning signs of grief turning dangerous than someone who'd lived it? He developed a presentation about sibling loss and misdirected anger, sharing it at conferences and support groups. Each time he told his story, he helped others recognize their own dangerous patterns. The shame transformed into purpose, the guilt into guidance for others. 5 years after Caleb's death, our family had found a new shape, not the one we'd planned, but one forged through unimaginable loss and hard-won healing. Dominic would always carry what he'd done, but he'd learned to carry it with grace rather than letting it crush him. We marked Caleb's birthday with a celebration of his life, funding art scholarships in his name. Dominic presented the awards, speaking about his brother with love untainted by the darkness that once consumed him. The recipients didn't know the full story, only that Caleb's family wanted his creativity to inspire others. That evening, as we cleaned up from the celebration, Dominic pulled me aside. He thanked me for saving him from himself, for choosing to protect others even when it meant having him committed, for loving him through his worst moments while refusing to enable his destruction. I held my surviving son, both of us crying for everything lost and everything salvaged. We'd learned that grief could transform people in terrible ways, but with help, they could transform again. Not back to who they were, but forward to who they might become. The work continued daily. Therapy, medication, purpose, connection. Building a life that honored Caleb without destroying others. Learning to live with consequences while not being defined by them. Finding meaning in the ruins and building something worthwhile from the pieces. Some stories don't have clean endings. Ours certainly didn't, but there was redemption in the trying, hope in the healing, love in the learning to live again, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thanks for tagging along while I wondered through all this. I hope some of my questions got you thinking too. Catch you in the next one. Like the video. It helps more than you think.